My name is Dee Richmond, and I work for the U.S. Dry Bean Council. Yesterday, we were talking about what do we need to promote beans and to get people to eat more beans. And one of the topics that came up was to have beans in more convenient forms. And one of the forms that we talked about was the bean flours. Now, this is a new initiative for the U.S. Dry Bean Council, so we're still learning a lot, and we have a ways to go. But we have a great group of speakers today who have a lot of experience with bean flours, and so we're going to be talking to you about that. So let me introduce our panel. First of all, we have Olivia Rode, who is with ADM, and they are a supplier of bean flours and other bean ingredients. Next, we have Chef Brad Barnes, who you met yesterday. And Brad has worked with bean flours from a food service perspective. So he's going to be talking about that. And finally, we have Dr. Girish Ganjil from Washington State University, who's done a lot of work, a lot of research and work with different pulses and pulse ingredients. And he's going to be talking about the functionality of bean flours. So let's start off with Olivia.
Great. Alrighty, so let's do a brief intro into bean flours and help you guys really understand what are bean flours. But let's first back that up with some marketing data. So in 2021, ADM did a survey, and from that survey, we found that 52% of global food consumers were actually claimed to be flexitarians. So they were willing to substitute a meat in their diet for a more plant-based product, which is awesome. They're taking advantage of, if you guys have ever heard of like Meatless Mondays and other eating occasions like that, they are becoming more and more popular. So that ties directly into beans, eating beans as they are a plant-based product. I want to walk you through a few characteristics of bean flour specifically. So beans provide functionality or bean flour specifically provide functionality in a formulation. So bean flours are a bean that's milled down. It can be functionalized in various different ways so that it'll interact within your product, whether you want to put bean flours in a bread or a snack or even a meat analog product. Functionality is really key, and we can produce different functionalities by treating bean flours in different ways through different processes. Beans, as we've been talking today specifically, are a great high-quality protein with added nutritional benefits, as well as fiber. We keep talking about fiber and as it relates to other good things for our gut, but also needed vitamins and minerals. Bean flours are minimally processed. They are as clean label as you can get. Most bean flours can be labeled directly as the bean itself. So a navy bean flour can just be labeled as navy beans, which consumers are really looking for today. They also obviously are non-GMO and organic. So we can have many, many claims that come with those beans that can be called out on the front of pack, which consumers today are very cognizant of. The beans are whole food ingredients. They're so nutritionally dense. We're going to go through the nutritional content in the next slide. Clean label. But then there is also a very wide range of formats, whether it's a different particle size or whether it's a bean flour that the protein has been isolated so that it's an even higher protein in the bean than you find inherently. And beans can be used for their color. And that's why I wanted to show the different types of beans here. Color really is going to impact how a consumer relates to a product. If they're wanting to make their product maybe darker, then you might use a black bean. because a black bean, obviously, is dark, but when you mill it into a flour, it's going to maintain that darkness. So we can add color to our products when we're formulating them with bean flours, which is awesome. And then we all know that every bean has a different flavor profile. So that's another wonderful benefit of the selection of bean flours that we've shown here, and the many more that we will go through is whether you're looking for a nutty note or something that's a little bit sweeter, just choosing a different bean is really going to help you get there. Let's hit on the nutrient density of beans themselves. So there was another survey that was done by ADM, and we found that 63% of plant-based consumers are really, really watching the nutrient density of the products that they're eating. And so this chart is a great comparison of those typical grains that we're used to eating every day, corn, wheat, rice, and really understanding how those compare to beans. So we pulled specifically navy beans, black beans, and chickpeas. And the yellow highlights are what we really need to focus our attention on. Protein is 2 times higher in beans than it is in your typical corn and wheat products. Fiber, 3 times higher. Consumers continue to demand high fiber in their diets. And so eating beans and bean flours is a must. And then there's the other advantages of the higher potassium, higher iron, and higher magnesium contents, which all really play a critical role in a product developer's mind when they are formulating with these bean flours. So to kind of pull this all together, these last few days we've talked all about supply chain and just the wonderful story of beans. And so we're now going to link that story to our end consumer through this progression of formulating with a specific bean flour. And so beans, we've got to get out there and tell the story of the vertical integration story, the wonderful supply chain, our grower stories, connecting that with these large CPG companies to help them understand how sustainable and how wonderful of a story that this community has to tell. That's critical to make them want to put beans in their products because it's tough, believe me. I do it every single day. I sell bean flours every single day, and it's hard to get them to make that switch. But it shouldn't be, right? We've seen the nutrient density. We're going to talk about how functional they are. It should be very, very simple. So that's where we've all have to come together to really educate them on the importance of these beans. And then we're moving this along, and we will help you understand how to actually add these in your products. 2 examples right here. We have a cupcake that has bean flours in it. Specifically within bakery, navy beans are super popular because they're so light in color. It can be used to mimic wheat flour. And the consumer is not going to be, turned off immediately by the product's color itself. And then, of course, bean chips. I don't know how many of you have tried bean chips, but they're absolutely delicious. And bean chips are developed with usually a blend of flours and grits in combination. So these are further processed beans. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Brad, and he's going to hit on some innovations.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Great info. So I'll take it into a chef's perspective and just talk a little bit about how versatile beans are as an ingredient. Of course, we know they're really versatile as a whole product, and cooked beans and flavored beans and that sort of thing in stews and all the types of things that we're used to. Most people are not really used to thinking of them as a product that brings a flour or a starch to us. Just a little bit of reasoning. I always like to drive into the sustainability story. If you look at how some proteins perform, So you have the percent of reduced risk of premature death compared to red meat. So interesting. And all this came from CIA's work with Harvard School of Public Health. Additionally, and you'll see on the top, whole grains and legumes contribute positively to keeping people healthier, as do nuts. And then we have eating the proteins and minimally processed. We can eat those at that level of processing, which is very helpful, although processing can be very confusing at times. But a good positive result from using beans. They're valuable as a powder for a number of reasons. Nutritional, as certainly Olivia was talking about. The textural properties are multiple, depending on how you use them. They stabilize liquids very well, water activity. They're allergen-free for the most part, contributing to gut health, of course. And flavor additions can be there, or they can be very neutral. Beans do have a good taste, and many times, like in the bean chips, they had a great taste, but in other products, they can remain neutral. So my job is to give you some ideas and some thoughts about things that we know can work from a bean flour standpoint. Things, baked goods like pâte de Cajun. That was one of my initial projects with the folks here, I think almost 5 years ago. Works very well for this. It creates a very similar texture to tapioca flour, and of course then has that really nice browning ability and adds into the nutritional value of those delicious little tasty treats. Brownies. Make white beans, make a super, super brownie, and change that nutritional perspective so that even a dessert or a snack for children at school or people when they want something sweet, it makes it a little better. Here's a great one. Actually turning good nutritional products into what we might say is junk food. Making the tater tot from beans brings a whole new perspective of the value of that to your diet. Works very, very well. Additionally, there is the ability to create a breading system. And those breading systems can have multiple textures and certainly can be flavored. The bean product can actually go in the duster part of the system or the batter part of the system, or can be used to make crumbs very similar to panko. So all in all, when you think about how these things will be used, there's plenty of ways to integrate bean flours into products and give multiple attributes to that product that might not have been there before based on the nutritional attributes or the flavor or even the textural qualities. Now for some science. Girish has some great information, and I think you'll enjoy listening to that as well.
Thank you. Looks like it's working. It's pretty high tech for me. But, why don't we take a second? I just want to, this screen, this whole audio visual, it's so fantastic, right? Let's thank all those people behind this to make this happen. They're doing a fantastic job. All right. So thanks for your attention. And I'm going to do my best to go through this quickly so that we have some time for question and answers. So what I do in my role is looking at value addition. And that starts from, raw product when it's harvested. What are the components of it? And what are the benefits of each component? And how can we utilize them effectively into different food products? So that's sort of my background as well. I worked for a company called MGP Ingredients for a few years, and then for Frito-Lay, PepsiCo. So that's really where all my talk comes from, like in terms of value addition and ingredient functionality. Okay. All right. So my diagrams are simple. So this is how I look at it at a bean. Okay. Now within the bean, you see there is different polymers or different components. So starch is the biggest one, right? And then we have protein, we have fiber, there is some moisture there, and this is where all the nutrients are hidden there, right? With your minerals and things like that. but the majority component is your starch, protein, and fiber, right? Now, when you try to process this into a product, what we look at is the function. Okay? So the starch brings a certain function, protein does too, and fiber does too. And the function that a food processing person or a food scientist like me thinks about is not what happens inside the gut, what happens when you try to make the product, right? So say, for example, you're making a bread. Okay? You're trying to bake something. What do you need? Viscoelasticity, right? So gluten protein provides that. So that's why it has that foamy structure that it creates, right? When you think about beverage, a drink, it needs solubility, right? And other functions we look at is emulsification, gelling, right? So that's what we need to figure out. What function do each of these components bring to us? And the beauty about beans is, I've heard in the last day and a half, there's so much wonderful power, functionality power within these numerous varieties of beans. So it's important for us to understand what those functionalities are. Then you can find applications pretty quickly. So this here is a quick example of taking the flours and converting that into a snack. We heard a lot about making the products healthier. This is one way you can make a puff healthier by using, these are all whole bean flours. And I had to say thanks to Paul Angelino out of Bush Brothers. He sent me these grains. We milled them as a whole grain, and then we extruded them. And you can see you can make them puff, right? But what we found was, like, for example, fava puffs more than lima bean, right? So that's where your functionality comes in. So if you really want to make a puff bean, you have to pick the right bean, okay? So like that, any product you try to make, you want to make sure you pick the right bean or the right component of the bean. So these are some functionalities which a food product developer looks at. I don't look at an ingredient as where it's coming from. It's like, okay, can you give me thickening agent, emulsification, depending on the application. So an example I want to provide, I think the previous panel brought it up, the product called Just, J-U-S-T, which is a replacement for egg. If you ever heard Josh Tetrick talk, I would recommend listening to him, how their company came up with that product. It was because they accidentally discovered that the mung bean protein had that elasticity and viscosity and gelling all together at the same time. And voila, you found an application for it, right? And the same way with fava. Yesterday, at the end of the day, the local chef, he was talking about meringue. Can you make a meringue without the egg? And fava protein helps you with that because that gives you a good foaming capacity and good foaming stability. And that's why it helps. All right, so when you look at a grain, flour processing, these are the things you can do. You started with the whole grain or whole seed flour. That's what Olivia talked about. And then you can refine it, but generally that's when your fiber comes out. But you can add the fiber back later because what happens is another factor we always think about when you think of whole grain flour. The whole grain flour you mill and she mills or somebody else mills, the same seed will be different. Why? Because of the particle size, right? And if you take the whole seed and try to mill it, you don't get the fine particle size for all the components. Fiber mills differently, and starch mills differently, protein mills differently. So it's important to understand how they mill as well. So you can get flour, and you can also get protein concentrate, starch concentrate, and the refined fiber. So these are all different options you can come up with from your flour, from your beans. And this, I just wanted to show you how a flour versus a starch looks like under a microscope. Okay? All right, one thing here is a good example. What this chart is showing is basically the thickening capacity. This curve is higher it is, the thicker the flour, the paste is, okay? So that's why it's viscosity here, and it's a time, and this is temperature, right? So you're trying to make a soup, okay? So if you take a whole bean flour, and you see it doesn't have a thickening capacity. You separate the starch, now you get a really good thickening capacity, right? So you need to figure out what is the function that each component is bringing in, then you'll find the markets for it pretty quickly. All right, I always have to say this, I'm nobody without the support with all my stakeholders as well as my team. These are all the students and folks in the lab. So thanks to them and thanks to all of you.
Okay, I'm going to start the panel off and with some questions about bean flowers and beans and how we get there. And the first question is for Jarish. When we started talking about this, we were talking about from a science perspective, right? How do we get more beans put into flour, right? Like right now you see, or made into flour. Right now, the main beans that you see flour being made out of are fava beans and mung beans, right? And you see a lot of that in Asia where they're doing that. And you made the comments that for a lot of the types of beans that we produce in the U.S., like the red kidneys or some of those, that we really don't understand the functionalities of those different beans. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at the ones that are already into making flours or your availability of flours, people have identified the applications for them, right? So it is important, and how did they come up with the application? Because they tried it and they figured out that it works really well in making a certain product. And so we need to figure out what is the function. So maybe, with the beans that are grown, more in the US or wherever we're looking at, I would recommend taking those and doing a very simple study analyzing the functionality of them. And if possible, I would recommend, like refining it and also fractionating it, because that's really how the mung bean took off, where now everybody wants to use mung bean protein. The whole plant-based industry are fighting to get it, right? And the same thing with fava protein. But in those instances, you also have to think about what is the function of the starch from that? What is the function of the fiber from that, right? So an example I can give is like the pea industry. It took them a while, but now they fractionate the protein, and that goes into a lot of plant-based products. But they also figured out application for starch, and more importantly, the fiber, the nutritious part. Now they have figured out how to incorporate that into snacks and make the snacks healthier too. So I would recommend, starting out and understanding the functionality of the whole flour and the components of it.
I would just add to that another type of functionality that you can obtain with bean flours is by pre-cooking them. So it's a process of blanching, pre-cooking, so you're swelling that starch. You're then drying those pre-cooked beans, and then you can mill them. So that starch has been activated, and why we would use that is because it's going to hydrate more quickly in your application, whether that's in a beverage or whether that's in a dough system where you need it to work immediately. You can do that by pre-hydrating beans. So that's just another type of functionality that many people are using today in their product development.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting as you talk about the fractionation in the parts, you can also then put them back together to be customized to the way you need them to function in the product. So there's a lot of controllability there, and like you said with the process, as you think about when is it heated, when is it gelatinized to some extent, that also can make a great difference in the functionality of the end result.
When we're talking about bean flours, the competitors that we're really talking about are soy flour, because you see a lot of soy flour used in Asia, and some of the pea products, the pea protein, the pea starch, the pea flour, and again, a little bit of chickpea now, but those are really the ones that on the pulse side that have kind of jumped out first. And so I was asking someone once, I said, is it hard to fractionate a bean? And they said, oh, yeah, it's a lot harder to fractionate a bean than it is a pea or a soybean or whatever because the skin is tougher. And so it's harder to get the skin off. Is that true, or is that one of the myths that we need to bust?
You want to go ahead? So yes, so in beans, we just started working with beans, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and we are finding that when we have to dehull it, it is a little bit tougher than the, let's say for instance, dry peas, right? But that's probably because the dry pea industry has worked a lot on that over the years, trying to decorticate and, they call it the splits, right? They sell the splits. But it's not difficult. We can figure that out. I mean, I think we have flown people to the moon. We can figure out how to dehull, it's easier, yeah.
Don't you think too hybridization could probably weaken that, and right?
Absolutely. The other thing, so it's also important, I think in this industry, I've seen a lot of, like Scott and other folks who are plant breeders. They've done a fantastic job on addressing those issues, right? So it could be incorporated there too for the longer term. But for current varieties, I think we can figure out how to decorticate it. Yeah.
Next question. The next question also pertains to basically the same topic. A lot of the reasons that we've heard that people are using pea protein or pea flour or pea starch or even soy protein and soy flour. I mean, some of it is they've had more experience with them, like ADM has been selling soy for a long time, but also because beans are more expensive. And so people are starting out with a less expensive ingredient. And so my question is, can we compete with a more expensive ingredient as a bean flour?
I think since you said compete, it's a good way to look at it. And when you think about pluses and minuses, we know that soy particularly is getting a lot of attention for its allergen qualities. And that's super important to big feeders like business and industry, like military, like sports and entertainment, to keep those things down. And then when you look at raising the value factor, the best thing about a soybean, truthfully, is a lot of fat in there, right? And so it's much more valuable for its fat than it is for the other things, I think. So that one kind of moves to the side for me. I think we have to get very good at how to use the beans as an ingredient, and then they'll really start to take over, because the things that peas can do or lentils can do are not equal. I just don't think that we've made a big enough story of that yet.
And I would add that the other components that we can be competitive on in the edible bean industry versus soy or versus pea is truly flavor. Many of these product developers, when they're formulating with pea or soy, have to cover that flavor up because they are very undesirable flavors. Whether it's something that's very, very bitter or something that even tastes like, to be frank, a barnyard. Pea proteins are associated with barnyard smells, which is not pleasing at all. Beans, they don't have those notes. Navy beans and black beans, we don't have to worry about that as much. So I think that's a really good selling point and progression to start moving these beans into more of that protein space and higher protein space.
That's really a good point. I was at the military R&DA conference last fall, and there was a pea protein vendor there. And the product was very good, and they were touting it for ground meat replacement, of course. But part of their pitch was, but you need really strong seasonings or else this is too bitter. So don't eat it straight. And that's not a great thing. So I think it leaves us space.
It does.
Yeah, very valid points. I just want to add to that it is very true with the pea proteins in the market. There's a whole industry has emerged for masking, flavor masking, right? And they've gotten so innovative with that. But with the beans, if we can figure out once we have the protein, it doesn't have that kind of flavor, then you just saved some money for the product developers, right? Yeah, exactly. And at this point, I think if we can figure out, there is some unique functionality with let's say kidney bean has something unique. If we hit that, then you'll find applications pretty quickly with that.
Now beyond price, I'm going to switch to the economics of it. So people that make bean flour have told me that, or when they make bean ingredients or pulse ingredients like soy or peas, that it's important from an economic standpoint to be able to use the whole pea, right? So when you fractionate a pea, you take the starch and maybe you use it for noodles, and then you have the protein left. Or you take the protein and you use it in meat replacement. And then you take the fiber and you use it in pet food. And it just seems like, for example, for soy or for peas, that we've got a lot more applications for the different fractions, like especially the pet food industry, right, for the peas. So can you comment on the economics of the bean and maybe what kinds of things we can do once we fractionate it, or if we should focus on the flours, or what would you say?
I would always recommend the flour first. Try the flour, the whole flour itself. If that's going to work for you, then great. You're not going to have to worry about spending the extra money to add in those other components, most likely. You've got the fiber, you've got the protein, you've got the great carbohydrate load that you need. So first start with the flour. That's my best recommendation. Yeah.
I think that is good, and I've done enough work with it as a whole product, and it's very valuable across all those platforms that I mentioned. I think the fractionation comes in when you need to have a component that is strengthening a particular aspect of the milled product. So, to raise protein or to raise starch or whatever it is. I think that's the cool part about the fractionation.
Yeah, just to add, in terms of economics, right? Probably some business folks can tell better on that, but what common sense to me is, okay, you want to make the flour and use the flour to see if you can get the functionality, right? But keep in mind that you may not be able to explore everything, right? I just showed you one example of how much thicker one component was versus everything together, right? So you may have a hidden gem in that whole grain, right, that you may miss out, right? So, but on an industrial scale, it absolutely makes sense to go with flour, right, first. But from the dry bean console standpoint, as you're looking behind the doors, looking at okay, is there anything unique, right? So maybe you invest in, or the companies also can invest in figuring out, is there anything unique in their beans, right? And if they find it, boom, now you have a reason to jump in, right?
It's worthy innovation targets, yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question on the ingredient side, and then we're going to open it to the audience for Q&A. The panel this morning talked a little bit about lectins. And so in producing flours, bean flours, do you need to worry about lectins, and how do you deactivate it, or what's important? If you've got a pancake mixed with a bean flour or a pea flour, should you have worried about the lectins to get there?
So I think we all have a perspective about this, and we know that it's a if nothing else, an interesting part of what we have to deal with. And each of my colleagues, of course, has a really good view on it. My take is that we're talking about products that get cooked, and we're talking about processes that are safe in general, and processes that have functionality built into the thought process to make ingredients safe across the board.
I agree. So as long as you are hitting those critical quality control points to reduce your micro load, which usually you're going to do anyway if you're cooking a product in the end. Even snacks typically get cooked. The product that probably doesn't get cooked until you throw it into water is pasta. So you're never going to eat pasta from a box alone. Maybe you do, but that is a risk. So as long as you are controlling that risk with proper cooking, hitting specific temperatures, monitoring the moisture level of that final product, running those microbiological tests, I think you're going to be well taken care of, and it's not going to be a concern at all. If you start off with using a pre-cooked bean flour, it's definitely not a concern.
Not a lot to add, but essentially saying, validate your own process. Make sure that you're, reducing that or eliminating it. But in most cases, any cooked process, you should be able to eliminate them.
Let's go ahead and open the floor to questions and answers. Do we have any questions?
On the back.
I know we talked some about how we compete with the pea proteins and the soy proteins, but I wanted to also touch on whey protein. It's used a lot in different products. How can we, use our product to compete in that space?
I think we have the advantage of being able to say that it's a plant-based product. And so it's going to fit perfectly in a plant-based formulation. I think beans do bring a lot of characteristics that are similar to dairy, from mouthfeel that they add to a product and other characteristics. So I think the first and foremost would be able to offer an allergen-free claim that's truly is plant-based. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because with whey, there's excuse me, certainly the plant-based piece, but there's also availability and cost.
That's a good one.
And I don't think that's going to get any better where it is for us. I do think it's also a reason to innovate and figure out how to make better use of that bean protein, right? So there are a lot of opportunities there.
Mm-hmm.
Just what I want to add to that is, in the world of protein functionality and the protein modifications and other things, there's a lot being done. ADM has a whole pipeline of things on soy protein, for example. And so it depends on what function or what application are you looking at. So depending on that, so for example, we talked about meringue and, where fava protein is very useful, right? So, and mung bean protein brings in a different function. So in terms of beans, you have different tools. You just have to figure out which one might apply better in that particular application. And also, whey protein isolate cost is way higher.
Yeah.
You'll easily beat them on the price.
Well, that's kind of where I was going with that, is it seems like we have a little better shot at...
Yes.
And from just a sort of a social standpoint, if you look across all of the sports leagues, whether it's football, baseball, or anybody that does really high need energy, they're all looking towards more plant, and they know that those proteins work better. So I actually think we have great opportunity there.
Another thing I'm interested in hearing from all of you on is, today you can Google bean flour or any of these ingredient topics, and and there's a multitude of search topics that come back of people making their own bean flours and selling them, and things that aren't really, there's no regulation on any of this, and some of those things I know people are buying and maybe not getting the best experience from. Is there something that the council can do, or is there something the industry can do to make sure that people are getting a good experience from bean ingredients?
Courtney, you've heard me say this before, and it's dependent on the bean community to create the vertical integration, the marketing and the messaging and the product lines that are going to mitigate those issues. I think it's nice actually that they happen, because you see it on social media. It's good stuff, but I think it's time for this organization to really face those and say, wait a minute, that can't take over our world, right? I don't know what you all think.
It's some sort of, standardization. If you standardize something, then you also want people to innovate, right? We don't want to stop that. Because out of all those people who are doing, there might be one which is like fantastic, right? But yes, you have to create some sort of a balance. So maybe council has a bigger role to play there, or a group of you guys, get together and how to come up with some sort of even it's not enforcing a standard maybe, but it's like creating a standard. Whether you follow that or not, it's up to people, right?
I think it's just one more little tag on that. I think ag is so conditioned, and this is across all of U.S. ag anyway, so conditioned to saying we'll grow it, we'll sell it as it grows, and people will figure out what to do with it. And I really believe that there's probably another way to look at that.
There is, yeah. I think if we just come out with a recommendation as a council of these are the best recommended bean flour suppliers, I think that's going to be very helpful in their direction. That's probably be the first and easiest step to take as a group. But then the other, to tag off of what Brad was kind of hinting at there, is a lot of people just don't know how to use them. So we as an organization also have to get out there and truly educate on how do you really formulate with them. Suppliers are doing that today, but there's so few of us that truly are producing bean flours. We can't reach everyone. So we are going to need, like your help to talk more about bean flours, how to use them. Use us to your advantage as much as possible. And that's also going to help them make that right selection to have a great experience in the end.
We have one more question here, Dee, from our Asia folks. So I will read it, and it says, can the bean flour be used as a substitute for methane cellulose or egg powder as emulsifier or binder for plant-based products?
It can. You're probably going to find that it can't be used as a one-for-one. You're going to need other components to add into that. But bean flours do have emulsification properties. They can hold air, and they can hold on to and bind oil. So emulsifier does both, right? It holds on to water and it holds on to oil, depending on what type of emulsifier it is. So there are properties that can be used, beans can be used to start replacing some items like methylcellulose, but it's not going to be a complete one-for-one replacement.
And this is just from a chef's perspective, but all starches that I use, there's a thing that I always try, and that is to hydrate them, to cook them, and then to test their emulsification ability. So sometimes that also multiplies what's already there.
Mm-hmm.
They are wondering, because the answer is yes, it is stable for retort application?
In my experience with bean flours, the most stable in retort is going to be a raw bean flour, that the starch has not already been pre-cooked, because you're taking it through that really harsh cooking process of retort. And so you're going to want to start with a truly a raw bean flour rather than going with a pre-cooked bean. That's the best tip that I can offer from my experience.
So you essentially have to use the process and the ingredient together. In that case, you don't formulate completely. You put in the ingredients in the can and let it cook in the can.
Correct.
Okay.
Do we have?
Sure.
D, is there time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're looking at one particular type of bean, let's say you're looking at a pinto bean or something, obviously not all pinto beans are the same. So I was curious what variation you're seeing within types of beans in terms of functionality and everything.
Do you have I'll let you comment quickly and then I'll comment.
I'd say the most variation from my personal experience that I've seen is within chickpeas. And a lot of consumers even have preference over one type of chickpea over another. and they are going to work very differently and add different flavors. But that's probably the best I can answer that. I don't know, Girish, do you have any other feedback?
I might take an extra minute. Okay. Here it says we are out of time. So, I'll give you, walk through an example, okay? I'll use peas, lentils as an example because we have data on it, right? I mean, with the beans, we just started working with it. I don't have a lot of data to back up what I'll say, so I'll use peas. So with the peas, I'll tell you my own experience. When I was in the industry, we're making this product using an extrusion process, and formulation was good, and the product came out fine, and everything looked great. So the way it worked in our company was I had to go down to the pilot plant and start running it. And once it was running, then I left. George was my operator. George was like, calls me within 5 minutes. Girish, the product is out. I can't get the quality. I mean, I told George, try out different conditions a little bit and then see if it works. And no, you got to come down. Okay. So I go down and look at the extruder itself and see if there is any issues with that. No. Then my immediate thing is you look at the lot number of the ingredient. Okay. The lot number is still the same. I'm like, what is wrong, right? Couldn't figure out, okay? But later, when now that tells you the company was like, I don't know, we can't rely on an inconsistent quality ingredient, so we can't launch this product, right? This is what many of the end product processors face. So I went back when I was faculty and I was in WSU and I reached out to the council, and then I went and looked at how the farmers put the grains and the varieties into the bins. What they do, the practice previously was looking at the color and the size, I'm going to put it in this bin. I don't care which variety, right? So what happened was you have like 7, 8 varieties in the same bin of the same, type of seed, right? And then we took each variety separately and tested the quality. They were all over the place. So from previous application perspective where they were selling it, it was okay because, it was always into fried snacks as a whole seed, and it was fine because they wanted the color and the same size. But the functionality was varying. So then we did a broad study across all varieties for peas, lentils, chickpeas. What we found was within a particular, so let's say it's red bean, so in this case, let's say yellow pea, within that, every variety is a little bit different. Okay. Now add to that the growing conditions. Now add to that, you grow in different parts of the world. So there is variation. So, but it is important to consider, varietal differences too. Something to think about, but I don't know within the bean world how much of that variation is there.
And I know time is gone, but again, chef's perspective is that, and I've actually done this quite a lot, age of the dried bean, I believe time in field and drying process, and probably even Mother Nature, all create change in these varieties and change in what you get in your bag on your table. Additionally, the pluses are that each of these beans, black, pinto, white, all throughout kidneys, all have interesting variabilities. And I think that is the space for the innovation and part of how we tell the story to get these things sold more often. Yay.
Good job.